Carlton Pike had cooked for heads of state, 2 sitting presidents, and a prince who flew him overseas for a single meal. He arrived at a wilderness retreat by helicopter with a camera crew, 4 Wagyu steaks worth $500 each, and the certainty that the man tending the campfire was beneath his attention. The man tending the campfire was Merritt Hale, a widowed backcountry guide making $400 for the weekend, with a 6-year-old daughter on the tailgate and a stuffed otter missing one button eye. By nightfall, one of them would be asked to leave. The other would be asked to stay. Merritt Hale set the canvas tool roll on the tailgate of Boone's truck and counted the knives by touch through the fabric. 8, the same 8 he had carried on every contract since the year Kira was born, and the leather ties still smelled like wood smoke and motor oil no matter how many times he wiped them down. Beside the tool roll sat a small pink backpack with 1 broken zipper and a gray stuffed otter buckled into the chest strap as if it were riding a roller coaster. The otter's name was Nimble, and it had 1 original button eye. The other had been replaced with a dark coat button after an incident involving a screen door and an ambitious squirrel that Kira still described as the robbery. Kira sat cross-legged on the tailgate with her boots hanging over the edge. She had lined up 4 pine cones on the metal beside her, smallest to largest, and was working on a 5th when a black SUV pulled into the gravel lot of Camp Orison and parked 3 feet from a puddle. A man in a navy suit stepped out, looked at the mud, and chose a path that added 30 feet to his walk. "The shiny shoes are losing to the mud," Kira said. "Mud usually wins if people argue with it." Camp Orison sat on 12 acres of cleared pine above a basalt river in the Adirondack foothills, and the retreat company had booked it for 3 days because a billionaire needed her senior staff to learn something about leadership that could not be taught in a conference room with a projector and a catered lunch. Merritt had been hired to manage the fires, maintain the outdoor cooking stations, and keep the wood supply dry. His rate was $400 for the weekend, which was not enough, and also more than he had made in the past 2 weeks repairing small engines in the county shop. His sitter had canceled 2 days before departure. He had disclosed the situation in writing, and Jessa Brindle, the junior operations coordinator who had arranged his contract, had approved Kira's presence on site with the condition that she stay within arm's reach. Jessa knelt beside a catering crate near the staff tents, peeling wet shipping labels off a tangle of extension cords. Her hands were red from the cold, and her hair was coming loose from a ponytail that had been practical at 6 in the morning and was now defeated. She looked up when Merritt passed. "The propane fittings are wrong again," she said. "Boone's arguing with the driver at the loading dock. He'll win. He always brings his own adapters." Grant Oakes, Darrow Applied Logistics Risk Management Director, appeared from behind the dining pavilion with a tablet pressed against his chest like a shield. He photographed a tent stake, muttered something about insurance riders and soil anchoring, and stopped when he saw Kira on the tailgate. "Is the child on the manifest?" "She's on mine," Merritt said. Grant opened his mouth, reconsidered, and photographed the truck instead. Merritt rubbed ash from the old fire ring between his thumb and forefinger and held his hand at his side. The gray left his index finger first, pulling northeast. Wind from the lake steady, cold enough to gutter an open fire without a windbreak. He adjusted the tarp wall by 2 stakes without explaining why, checked the stack of split hardwood he had seasoned and delivered the week before, and walked back to the truck. Kira had finished her pine cone line and was holding Nimble against her chin, watching the executives file past with rolling luggage designed for airport carpet. "They brought suitcases," she said. "To dirt. Different kind of packing." Kira considered this with the seriousness she gave most adult behavior. She tucked Nimble into the front pocket of Merritt's canvas jacket, where the otter's head poked out like a passenger in a lifeboat, and hopped off the tailgate. The helicopter landed at 2:15, though it had been expected at noon. Carlton Pike stepped off the pad carrying nothing. His sous chef, Renzo Bell, followed with both arms rigid around a hard-sided cooler, and behind Renzo came 2 assistants, wheeling Pelican cases of induction burners, vacuum sealers, temperature probes, plating lights, and a camera rig on a collapsible dolly. Carlton wore chef's whites so clean they looked laminated, He crossed the gravel lot without adjusting his path for mud, and his shoes came through untouched, which meant either luck or the particular confidence of a man who expected the ground to accommodate him. He was tall and narrow-shouldered, with hands that had never carried their own equipment, and a jawline that had been photographed for 3 separate magazine profiles. He stopped at the fire ring and looked at Merritt's stacked hardwood, the split kindling arranged by thickness, the ash-blackened grate balanced on river stones. "Charming," Carlton said. He did not look at Merritt when he said it, which was worse than if he had. A campfire is not a kitchen. It is smoke with confidence. Renzo set the cooler on the prep table and opened it with the care of a man handling evidence. Inside, nested in gel packs and vacuum-sealed in clear plastic, lay 4 A5 Wagyu strip steaks. The marbling ran through the meat like white rivers through pink clay, and even in the cooler's shadow, the fat caught the light. Each steak was worth more than what Merritt had in his checking account, and Merritt knew this because he had looked up the price on his phone the night before to understand what kind of failure he was being asked to prevent. Vivian Darrow arrived on foot from the main lodge. She was 41, narrow-shouldered in a different way than Carlton, compact where he was elongated, controlled where he was performative. She carried no bag. Her staff carried bags. She looked at Carlton's setup, then at Merritt's fire ring, and filed them into separate categories without comment. Merritt fell into the one marked local color. "Chef Pike," Vivian said, "the dining pavilion is yours. Mr. Hale maintains the fires and the outdoor stations. I trust there won't be territorial confusion." Carlton smiled at Renzo. "Keep the campfire man away from the beef." Kira stood behind Merritt's left leg, 2 fingers hooked through his belt loop. She had retrieved Nimble from his jacket pocket and held the otter against her ribs. The coat-button eye stared at Carlton with the fixed judgment that only stuffed animals and small children are capable of delivering without apology. Merritt looked at Carlton's induction burners, then at the single extension cable running from the generator shed to the pavilion, then at the camera rig's power block daisy-chained off the same line. He counted the load in his head: 1,200 watts per burner, 800 for the camera rig, 500 for the plating lights, and said nothing about any of it. "Then keep your kitchen running." Carlton's smile did not change, but his hands, which had been resting loosely on the prep table, came together and interlocked. His fingers went white at the knuckles for exactly as long as it took for Merritt to turn and walk back to the fire ring. The generator coughed at 412. Merritt heard it from the fire ring, where he was splitting kindling with Kira sorting the pieces into 3 piles by thickness. Her system, not his, and she was strict about it. The cough came again at 4:14, and again at 4:15, and the third time it carried a mechanical stutter that turned Merritt's head toward the shed. He set down the hatchet and told Kira to stay with the pine cones. She placed Nimble on guard duty beside the smallest pile and saluted the otter with 2 fingers, which was a ritual she had invented and which Merritt had never questioned. He walked to the generator housing. The air near the shed wall was warm on the left side and cool on the right, which meant the exhaust was pooling instead of venting. He knelt and found the extension cable pinched beneath a catering crate that someone had shoved against the wall during setup. The insulation had not split yet, but the plastic smelled sweet and chemical and wrong, the particular wrongness of wiring that was generating heat it was never designed to hold. Jessa was passing with her clipboard. "Turn it off before it stops being a problem and starts being a fire." Jessa looked at the cable. Her face went pale, then set. "I need that in words Grant can put in a report." Overloaded circuit, pinched cable, inadequate ventilation on the left exhaust port. The crate's been sitting on the line since setup. If the insulation fails under load, you've got exposed wiring next to a fuel tank. Kira appeared at the shed door with a stick in one hand and Nimble in the other. "It sounds like Boone's truck before it died," she said. 3 coughs, and then quiet. The generator died at 4:27. The induction burners blinked off in sequence. The plating lights went dark. The vacuum sealer's compressor wound down with a long, descending moan that sounded like the end of someone's plan. Carlton stood in the pavilion beside 4 perfect Wagyu steaks and a kitchen that no longer had electricity. His face went through several arrangements, disbelief, calculation, anger, before settling on one that pointed outward. "Your logistics are amateur," he said to Jessa. $400 a pound sitting on melting ice because your extension cords belong in a hardware store clearance bin. "The cable was under your crate," Jessa said, but her voice had the sound of someone who knew the room would not believe her, because the room did not need to. Merritt stepped into the pavilion. He did not raise his voice. "The food needs to be cooked within 90 minutes, or it crosses from a dinner problem to a safety problem. That's the constraint. Blame doesn't change the temperature of the cooler." Vivian watched from the pavilion entrance with her arms folded. She had not spoken, but her eyes had moved from Carlton's face to Merritt's hands, and she had noticed that they were still. "There are flat basalt stones in the riverbed," Merritt said. "Dry ones above the waterline, baked all day. I can build a draft-fed fire that will hold cooking heat long enough to do this properly. It won't be what you planned, but it'll be safe and it'll be good." Carlton laughed. The laugh was not large. It was precise and dismissive, calibrated for the 3 executives who had drifted within earshot. "Boy Scout theater," Carlton said. Kira spoke from behind the tent flap, where she had followed Merritt despite instruction. "Dad cooks fish on rocks when the pan is too thin." Carlton looked at her. "This is not fish." Merritt met his eyes. "No, it's less forgiving." The riverbed below Camp Orison ran over basalt that had been cooling for 10,000 years. Merritt walked it with Kira on his left, Tamsin Vale on his right, and Renzo behind them carrying a folded canvas tarp. Tamsin was the retreat medic and a former county EMT with blunt-cut hair and hands that moved with the economy of someone who had started too many IVs in bad light. She had been checking a blister on an executive's heel when the generator died and had come to the riverbed because Merritt had asked for someone with first aid clearance near the stones in case of a cracking incident. She watched him reject stone after stone, too porous, too round, damp on the underside, a hairline crack running through the face that would split at 300 degrees. "You still check stone like bone china," she said. "Stone breaks louder." She nodded. The familiarity between them was old and specific. A winter search and rescue call 3 years back, a lost hiker, ice on the trail, and Merritt's knowledge of the ridgeline that had cut the search time in half. Neither of them talked about it now, but it sat between them like a reference letter that did not need to be opened. Merritt selected 3 flat pieces of dry basalt from a shelf above the waterline, where the morning sun had baked them all day. He tapped each one with a knuckle and listened. Dense. No hollow spots. No ring that indicated a trapped air pocket. He had Renzo wrap them in the canvas tarp, not bare-handed, because a basalt edge could open a palm before the brain registered the cut. Kira found a stump near the water and set Nimble on top of it, facing the river. "Watch for exploding rocks," she told the otter. Renzo, who had not smiled since arriving at Camp Orison, pressed his lips together and looked at the water. They carried the stones back to camp. Merritt stacked them near the fire ring and began clearing a patch of bare earth 6 paces from the pavilion. He had been back for less than 10 minutes when Carlton appeared behind the generator shed, out of the pavilion's sightline. His whites were still clean. His hands had stopped moving. "I have a proposal," Carlton said. "You present the stone method as my planned rustic course, a contingency I designed. Wilderness haute cuisine. My concept, your hands." Merritt looked at him without expression. "Say it was my contingency, and I'll make this worth more than your weekend rate." "That's not what I sell." Carlton's jaw tightened. He dropped his voice to the register men use when they are about to trade the truth for leverage. "The generator overloaded because I needed all burners and the camera rig running simultaneously. Renzo warned me about the load. I told him to add the plating lights anyway, because Vivian's media team wanted footage. If that becomes the story, my contract with Darrow is done." The retreat becomes a liability narrative instead of a leadership one. From behind the stacked firewood, close enough to hear but not to be seen, Jessa Brindle stood with her clipboard pressed against her chest. Her mouth was slightly open. The color had come back to her face, but it was the wrong color, the flush of a person realizing they were almost destroyed for someone else's mistake. Carlton waited for Merritt to negotiate, or counter, or ask how much. Merritt picked up the canvas roll and walked back to the fire ring. He dug the hole in 30 minutes. 2 chambers connected by a tunnel angled at 30 degrees. The burn chamber on the downwind side. The intake tunnel feeding air from the northeast. The Dakota fire hole was not a trick. It was physics. A draft-fed system that concentrated heat below ground level, burned hotter and cleaner than an open fire, and built a coal bed that held temperature the way a bread oven holds the ghost of every loaf. Kira handed him sticks from her sorted pile, passing each one like a surgical instrument, with a small nod of approval when he accepted it. When Grant Oakes stepped too close with his tablet and planted his right heel on the blanket where Nimble was sitting, Kira stopped mid-handoff. Nimble says feet go around the blanket. Vivian stood 4 paces behind Grant. She had been watching Merritt dig for 10 minutes without speaking. She looked at Grant. "Mr. Oakes." Grant stepped back. He did not need the sentence finished. Merritt laid the fire with a platform of finger-thick hardwood, a nest of birch bark and dried pine shavings, and a cabin stack that would collapse into coals within 20 minutes. The intake tunnel faced the northeast wind he had measured from the ash that morning. He struck a single match. The draft caught in under 10 seconds, and the flame was drawn down into the chamber instead of rising into open air, which made Renzo lean closer. "How do you know it's pulling right?" Renzo asked. "Hold your hand over the intake." Renzo did. "Feel the pull?" Renzo nodded. "That's the fire breathing in. When the pull is steady, the coal bed is getting even oxygen. Even oxygen means even heat." While the coals built, Merritt set the basalt slabs on the ground beside the chamber and waited. He would not place them until the bed was deep enough to heat the stone evenly, because rushing meant hot spots, and hot spots meant cracked stone or scorched meat or both. Patience was the technology. It had always been the technology. When the coals were right, a deep bed of orange and white pulsing with the slow rhythm of something alive, Merritt placed the largest slab across the chamber opening and let the heat soak in. He trimmed a ribbon of fat from the edge of one Wagyu steak with a knife from his canvas roll and laid it on the warming stone. The fat began to render, slowly, not sizzling. A whisper. He rubbed the liquefied fat across the surface with a folded cloth, not greasing it the way a diner cook would grease a flat top, but seasoning it, building a barrier between $500 beef and 10,000-year-old basalt. He crushed wild garlic between his palms and scattered it near the coals. 3 green pine needles, not dry, not brown, green, went on the coal edge where they would produce smoke at low combustion, not flame. Vivian had moved closer without seeming to decide to. She stood at the edge of the cleared ground and watched Merritt hold his open palm 6 inches above the stone, counting. "You're measuring without instruments," she said. "No, I'm using different ones." Kira sat on the upturned canvas bag with Nimble in her lap, the otter's single button eye reflecting the fire. She had stopped sorting sticks and was watching her father's hands the way she always did when his attention went fully into his work, with the quiet focus of a child who knew this version of her father was not to be interrupted, but was always, always worth watching. The executives gathered in the dining pavilion by 7. 18 people at a long table of reclaimed pine, with wine glasses catching the last daylight off the lake, and cloth napkins folded into shapes that belonged in a different zip code. The mood was the careful neutrality of corporate employees who did not know whether the evening would be impressive or embarrassing, and had decided to perform interest until the data came in. Carlton stood at the head of the table. He had changed into a fresh set of whites. He had combed his hair. His posture was that of a man who had lost control of the kitchen and was now attempting to control the narrative. "Before we proceed," he said, and his voice had the practiced steadiness of someone who has rehearsed. "I need to register a safety concern for everyone at this table." He turned to Vivienne. "Mr. Hale is improvising with river stones and wild plants and an unregulated fire pit. There is no certified temperature protocol. He has exposed $500 imported beef to pine smoke and cooked it on rocks pulled from a riverbed." He paused. The pause was professional. This man is about to turn imported beef into a lawsuit. The table went silent. Grant's hand moved toward his tablet. Jessa, standing near the service entrance, gripped her clipboard so hard, the metal clip bent upward with a small ping. Kira sat on a bench behind Merritt, near the pavilion's back wall. She held Nimble against her chest with both hands, and her fingers pressed the coat button eye until the fabric bunched around it in small folds. Merritt did not look at the executives. He did not look at Carlton. He looked at Grant. "Then write down what I do." Grant hesitated. Vivienne nodded once. Grant opened his tablet's recording application. Merritt spoke while he worked, not performing, not teaching, documenting. For the record Grant was now keeping, every decision and its reason. Dry basalt selected above the waterline. No calcium deposits, no moisture pockets, no fracture lines. Each stone tapped for density before transport. Heated gradually over a deep coal bed for 40 minutes, not thermal shocked. The rendered fat is from the same Wagyu being served. Wild garlic identified by smell, leaf shape, and bulb structure. It grows along this bank every spring, and I've harvested it 4 years running. Green pine needles on the coal edge for smoke at low combustion. No open flame contact with the protein at any point. Renzo stood near the cooler. His arms were crossed, but during Merritt's recitation, his weight had shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that he was no longer standing on Carlton's side of the pavilion. "The generator overloaded because the induction burners, the camera rig, and the plating lights were running on one circuit," Renzo said. His voice was flat and steady, the sound of a man who had finished carrying someone else's lie and had set it on the ground. "Chef Pike was told the load was too high. He added the plating lights anyway." Carlton's mouth opened. His hands, which had been tucked behind his back in the posture of authority, came forward and found nothing to hold. He did not speak, because every sentence available to him would make him smaller. Merritt placed the first steak near the coals, not on the stone. Low heat, indirect. The Wagyu absorbed the garlic and pine scent while its internal temperature climbed slowly toward 115 degrees. He turned it once, by feel, when the fat on the underside began to whisper against the warm basalt beside the fire hole. Then rest. He moved the steak to the cool edge of the slab, covered it with a folded piece of clean canvas, and waited. 3 minutes. The pavilion was silent, except for the fire's breathing and the insects beginning their shift change over the lake. When the rest was done, Merritt transferred the steak to the hottest section of stone. The sear was immediate and audible, a clean, sharp hiss that rose into the evening air and made 2 executives lean forward in their chairs. He pressed the meat once with the flat of his knife to feel the resistance beneath the crust, counted to 40, turned it. The underside was dark amber, glazed with its own fat, and it smelled like smoke and garlic and something that predated every kitchen ever built. He cut 1 slice. The center was rose pink from edge to edge. No gray band, no raw center, no cold spot. The marbled fat had rendered through the muscle in threads so thin they had become flavor instead of texture. Merritt placed the first piece on a clean plate and carried it to Renzo, because Renzo had handled the beef honestly from the beginning and had not looked away when the truth cost him his loyalty to his chef. Renzo looked at the slice, then at Carlton. Then he ate it standing up, which was a decision that did not require explanation. Vivienne received the second plate. She cut the slice in half with her knife, ate 1 piece slowly, and set the knife down with the control of a woman revising a quarterly projection in real time. Kira leaned forward on the bench. Nimble was tucked under her arm, the coat button eye catching the firelight. "He doesn't make food fancy," she said. "He makes it listen." Vivian looked at Carlton. The table looked at Carlton. 18 executives, a sous chef, a medic, an operations coordinator, a risk manager with a recording tablet, and a 6-year-old with a one-eyed stuffed otter, all looked at Carlton Pike. "Chef Pike, step away from the table." Carlton's hands, which had been reaching toward his knife roll, stopped. He looked at the Wagyu on the stone, at the executives eating in silence, at the girl who had described his career's end with more precision than any trade review ever published. He stepped back, then he stepped away. Grant filed the report by 9:30. The document confirmed the electrical overload, Renzo's ignored warning, the pinched cable beneath the catering crate, and Merritt's sequential food safety documentation. Vivian read it on her tablet in the camp office. A converted storage cabin with a desk, a single overhead light, and the faint smell of cedar and old paperwork. Carlton stood by the door with his knife roll under one arm. He did not apologize and he did not explain. Those would come later, drafted by someone whose profession was making failure resemble growth. Vivian terminated his contract with a single sentence and a reference to Clause 11. Carlton walked to the helicopter pad alone, and the sound of his shoes on the gravel was the last the camp heard of him. Jessa sat in the corner of the office with her clipboard flat on her knees. "The logistics failure was not yours," Vivian said. "That will be in writing by morning." Jessa nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she did not wipe them in front of her CEO, and Vivian did not pretend not to notice, which was its own form of respect. Vivian turned to Merritt. "I want to discuss a consulting arrangement. Quarterly retreats, outdoor programming, fire safety, and food service. A real contract, not a weekend rate." Merritt was quiet for a long time, long enough that the silence acquired its own weight, and Vivian, who was accustomed to people filling silence with eagerness, began to recalibrate once more. "I don't take work that teaches my kid she comes second." Vivian studied him. The weather-pale scar along his forearm, the left thumb permanently flattened from a splitter accident, the ash still caught in the creases of his knuckles. "Then we will write the offer correctly." The pavilion lights were off. The executives had gone to their cabins or drifted to the lodge bar, and the long table stood empty under a sky that had turned the color of deep water. Merritt sat beside the lakeside fire ring on a flat stone that was too cold for cooking, and still warm enough from the day's sun to feel like a kindness. Kira sat beside him with Nimble propped against a tin plate that held a piece of camp bread with melted butter. She did not like soft red meat and never had, and Merritt had never once tried to convince her, because a man who respects a steak's nature ought to respect his daughters. Boone Alday came down from the loading dock with 2 bottles of water and a face that said he had heard the full story and would discuss none of it unless Merritt opened the door. Merritt did not open the door. Boone sat beside him and handed him a bottle and said nothing, which was the correct offering from a man who had lent his truck and his back apartment and had never once called it charity. Jessa appeared briefly to return a tarp she had borrowed. Tamsin checked Kira's hands for splinters and found none, and said goodnight by touching Merritt's shoulder once. Vivian walked down from the lodge alone. No assistance, no tablet. She carried the folded copy of Grant's report that Merritt had left on the office table and held it out to him without commentary. "You forgot this." Merritt took it and tucked it into his jacket pocket, beside the envelope marked Kira Boots/Winter that still held $47. The fire cracked. The lake held the last blue of the sky, like something it was not ready to give back. Kira leaned against Merritt's side with the slow tilt of a child whose body is making decisions her mind has already surrendered. Nimble slipped from her lap to the ground, landing on a bed of pine needles with the remaining button eye facing the water as if keeping watch. "Did the rock win?" Kira asked. Her voice was soft and blurred at the edges. Merritt picked up the otter and settled it on Kira's chest, where it rose and fell with her breathing. the gray fur smelling faintly of smoke and garlic and the particular warmth of a day that had asked too much and still ended gently. No, supper did. Kira's eyes closed. Her fingers curled around Nimble's arm. Merritt sat with his daughter against his ribs, and the fire between them in the dark, and he did not move until the coals went white and the lake gave back the last of the blue. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and leave a comment. It means more than you know.